Hi guys, welcome back to my channel. This video covers the most important theme in An Inspector Calls, social responsibility. Because the author J.B. Priestley was a socialist himself, this entire play is a not-so-subtle advertisement for socialism, and a lesson about the importance of looking out for each other rather than focusing only on self-preservation. In your exams, you may see this theme worded a little differently, like duty or responsibility, but all the points we will cover here will be relevant regardless. If you need a quick recap of the plot of An Inspector Calls, be sure to check out my 7-minute summary linked in the description below. So, let's start off with a bit of context about why social responsibility and socialism was such an important topic at this time in history. This play was published in July 1945, just before the end of the Second World War, so as you can imagine, this was a time of huge conflict and suffering, with millions of people's lives and families permanently affected or destroyed. As a result, people were starting to get pretty sick of all the fighting and the politicians who had led them into this war, and new ideas of socialism, which favored the common good, were starting to replace the traditional ones of capitalism and classism. We know this to be true because in the same month that this play was published, the Labour Party in the UK won a shock victory over the Conservative Party, despite the fact that the Conservative Prime Minister Winston Churchill was viewed as a national hero for leading the country to victory. Socialist ideas were gaining widespread popularity, therefore, and An Inspector Calls really encapsulates these ideas, as the character of Inspector Ghoul is essentially J.B. Priestley's mouthpiece for his political views on social responsibility. Because the inspector is a figure of unquestionable moral authority in this play, it is made very clear to the audience that social responsibility and socialism were right, and self-preservation and capitalism were wrong. At the beginning of the play, the Birlings and Gerald Croft are presented as typical examples of the wealthy upper class in 1912, which is when the story takes place. Social classes were very distinct at this time in history, and they rarely ever mixed, so the rich were often incredibly ignorant of the struggles of the poor, and frankly didn't really care because they thought that they were beneath them anyway. Mr. Birling in particular is the antithesis of social responsibility, which he makes clear in this extract from his speech to Eric and Gerald. The only things that Mr. Birling cares about are himself and his profits. Even his own family is an afterthought, as he only cares about them in regards to how they improve his social image. He speaks with authority on this subject as a man with lots of life experience, but Priestley already discredits Birling by having him make some comments earlier, which the audience knows are not true, such as the Titanic being unsinkable, or that the First World War would never happen. Because of this, we are conditioned to disagree with him on all of his opinions, as he clearly doesn't know what he's talking about. Additionally, the language he uses to describe socialism, like cranks and nonsense, is purposely obnoxious and dismissive in order to turn the audience against him. Priestley is using Mr. Birling as an example of the capitalist businessmen whom he blamed for leading the country into war with their greed and allowing the most vulnerable in society to suffer. In just one short paragraph, he consistently repeats his views about looking after himself, and it is at this moment that he's interrupted by a sharp ring of the doorbell. This dramatic occurrence foreshadows the inspector's intervention and lets us know that Mr. Birling is about to be proven wrong. However, as the personification of capitalism, Mr. Birling never takes any responsibility or blame throughout this play, and learns nothing from the inspector's lessons. His only concern seems to be for his profits, not his workers, as he comments, "It's my duty to keep labor costs down." In his mind, this is a perfectly reasonable excuse to justify paying his employees an unlivable wage and firing Eva for wanting more. He doesn't even show compassion for her despite the shocking manner in which she commits suicide, and is only concerned about how it affects him and his chance of a knighthood. Similar to her husband, Mrs. Birling is another character who refuses to take responsibility for her role in Eva's death. As a representation of a so-called respectable upper-class woman, her values and sense of duty are completely warped by her prejudice towards the working class, and to women like Eva who have been taken advantage of by men. Ironically, she runs a charity that helps women in distress, but when Eva approaches her for help, Mrs. Birling refuses to take her case for the simple fact that she called herself Mrs. Birling, or in other words, because she dared to pretend like she was from a class and family that she was not. Rather obnoxiously, Mrs. Birling feels completely entitled to look down on Eva, and freely admits it, saying, "Naturally, that was one of the things that prejudiced me against her case." Priestley's point here is that although there were charities set up by the wealthy with the intention of helping the poor, those that were the most desperate and needed help the most were often turned down if they were not considered to be deserving cases. And it was the rich who had the luxury of deciding who was worthy of receiving their help. Because Mrs. Birling sees Eva as beneath her, she has no compassion for her either, and firmly believes that she did what was right. However, there is a big difference between the attitude of the younger generation and the older generation towards social responsibility in this play. While the Birling parents are portrayed as lost causes and learn nothing from the inspector, Sheila and Eric are able to understand their part in Eva Smith's death and have a desire to change their ways. Sheila in particular is deeply impacted by what the inspector says and truly grasps the concept of social responsibility and shared blame. Although she was aware that her behavior towards Eva was selfish and spiteful at the time, she never considered how it would affect her life after. So through Sheila, Priestley is showing that social responsibility means being mindful about your actions, as it is impossible to predict how they will affect others. In Priestley's eyes, Sheila represents hope for society in the form of the younger generation, who are able to learn from their mistakes and the mistakes of their parents. It is important to remember that Sheila did not start out this way at the beginning of the book, but learned from the ideas that the inspector introduces, in a similar way probably to how Priestley hopes the audience will learn from his views. Let's take a look now at the inspector's final speech before he leaves the Birlings' house. One Eva Smith is gone, but there are millions and millions of Eva Smiths and John Smiths still left with us. We don't live alone. We are members of one body. We are responsible for each other. And I tell you that the time will soon come when if men will not learn that lesson, then they will be taught it in fire and blood and anguish. This is the direct opposite of Mr. Birling's speech to Eric and Gerald at the beginning of the play, when the inspector arrives, as it preaches that our moral duty is to look out for the welfare of our fellow man, and be aware of how our actions affect others, rather than simply thinking about ourselves. The inspector's real lesson, therefore, isn't really about Eva Smith. It is about the millions of working-class people who are represented by her, and who can still be helped if the Birlings and society changes its ways. Throughout the play, the idea of shared blame and shared responsibility comes up often, as it wasn't one awful thing that drove Eva to suicide, it was a chain reaction involving all the Birlings and Gerald. In the same way that a lot of smaller wrong choices led to one terrible outcome, however, Priestley is also implying that a lot of small good actions can lead to widespread change and betterment of society. This was particularly relevant after the wars, as people and their communities needed to come together to help each other and rebuild what had been lost. The inspector's final words, "They will be taught it in fire and blood and anguish," is Priestley telling the audience that classism, capitalism, and neglect of the social good were direct causes of these wars, but socialism was the key to putting the world back together afterwards. It is also no mistake that this speech is extremely preachy and sounds eerily similar to a church sermon. Priestley knew that most of his audience were Christians, so by aligning his socialist views with religion, he was implying that socialist ideas were in fact Christian ideas. If you considered yourself to be a good Christian, he is saying, you had a moral obligation to look after your fellow man and work towards the common good. One of the most confusing aspects of this play is the ending, as once the inspector leaves, we find out that he is not really an inspector, and that Eva Smith might not have just been one girl, but several, and also that she may not have even died at all. This might seem like a strange twist at this point of the play, where it seems like everything has been laid out on the table and the Birlings have been given a good telling off. But it is really important because it leaves the Birlings and the audience room to question if they still need to take responsibility for what they have done, even if there are no consequences. The Birling parents are immediately relieved, as their only concern throughout all of this has been protecting their social image. However, Sheila and Eric now take on the mantle of the inspector and remind them that whether Eva died or not, or if she even existed at all, they are still guilty of acting without regard for the welfare of others and negatively affecting the lives of those they had influence and power over. Priestley's challenge to the audience, therefore, is to learn to live life with the awareness that everything we do affects other people, whether or not we are ever held accountable for it. Thanks for watching, guys! Stay tuned for follow-up analysis videos soon to come. See you next time!